Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is something of a Ukraine War Update Extra video, and I have so much content for my extras, and this is not the content. So this is a reaction to a few comments from a thread in one of my earlier videos today where I just mentioned the EU. This is not going to be about pro-Brexit, pro-EU or whatever. I want to sort out a logical fallacy that is often of double standards that is often employed when talking about the EU, talking about funding, talking about activity of countries within the EU, countries outside of the EU, and just understand we need to be a little bit more nuanced when we're talking about this topic. And here's an example of that. So I could talk about, someone here saying it's an unelected corrupt EU and we're better out and all open borders and legal. I could talk about how I respond to those kind of accusations, but actually that's not really what I want to say. What I want to say is to do with a few comments that were quite similar. Here's one that says, thanks for your effort in compiling a great and informative bulletin every day. I do find your observations on the EU rather over-egged. Ukraine would not exist if it were not for the early arming of Brexit Britain. Scholz at last decided where he stands. Very pleased about it, but it was nearly a year before he stood up to be counted. The EU does not have any money of its own, only the taxes from membership countries, and is nearly 9 months into the war before they came fully on board. France, another matter, they were still supplying components for the Russian war machine 8 months into the war. Don't get me wrong, I am pleased that we're all putting together now. Please God, it stays this way. Okay. And then a similar one, which is that the UK responded to Ukraine's needs while the EU was still trying to organise a meeting to discuss it. Not shouting for Brexit, but don't assume it's black and white. Now, this is really similar to an issue. I wrote an article back in May last year, and it's called "Heads I Win, Tails You Lose: Attacking the EU with Double Standards." And I just want to clarify this because it's sort of what's being mentioned there. And I'll return to those comments in a second. Now, this is I wrote this article in response to, and I publicly called him out, Francis Durney from Ukraine, the latest podcast, right, which I reference a lot on this on my channel. But actually, sometimes, being the Daily Telegraph, they nail their political colours to the mast, and they, particularly actually at the beginning of when they were doing Ukraine the latest, I think they've kind of worked out that they've got an audience now that isn't just kind of Daily Telegraph readers, but actually is a global audience. They've got a huge international readership, or viewership, listenership. As well as across the political spectrum in the UK, like myself, I listen to it. I think it's an excellent podcast, but they have at times been a bit politically, I guess, naive, perhaps. And I called Francis Durney out on this, and then contacted him on Twitter to say this. And I think they referenced it in one of their next Ukraine the latest, actually, and sort of answered what I said. But here's a really massive example. To me, a really massively obvious example of double standards, and it talks to some of the comments that were made this morning, right, and a couple that I've just read. So here's what Francis Durney said, and in the article I set up a bit more context as well and talk about where he leads up, slagging off the EU a little bit and whatnot. But he says this. So let me read this. But actually, it's been really slow. This is the EU. Slow getting out of the gates in terms of what it could have done to support Ukraine initially. Remember, this is back in May last year. Think of the skepticism of Germany and, of course, one of the major powers within the European Union, France's mishandling around Minsk, etc. It's been a very, very slow and rather languid approach. And I would just make the comment that if we had been truly relying on the European Union for a response on this, in a way that many people within the European Commission would like us to, then I don't think Ukraine would have been able to put up the resistance that it has, having received the support from Czech Republic, from Poland, and of course from Great Britain in terms of military support. I don't think this is a great moment for the European Union, and I think this war has shown yet further cracks in the edifice, sorry, I did a typo there, of what we call the European project. Right, I don't know if you noticed the double standards here, but let me point it out. So initially, Francis Durney slags off Germany and France as being representative of the EU, as being member states, and for being unilaterally slow to do things. So it said, think of the skepticism of Germany, of course, one of the major powers within the European Union, France's mishandling around Minsk, etc. In other words, look at how crap the EU is, because look at what Germany and France haven't been doing, right? And then later on, it says, but look at the wonderful support that Ukraine has received from the Czech Republic and from Poland. And it also mentions Great Britain. Now, that's interesting because the Czech Republic and Poland are members of the EU, right? So here they're saying these countries have done amazingly, and that's not because of the EU. And these countries have done badly, and that is because of the EU. In other words, that's the glaring double standard. You can't say this country's done crap, therefore the EU is crap, and this country's done really well, but I'm not going to connect that to the EU when both countries are in the EU. So you either have to say France and Germany have done crap, and that's nothing to do with the EU. That's just unilateral decisions by those governments to do whatever they want, and they've done it slowly. And the Czech Republic and Poland done really well, good stuff, and that's got nothing to do with the EU. Or you say France and Germany have done really badly, and that's the EU being bad, but Czech Republic and Poland done really well, and that's the EU being really good, right? You've got to be consistent. And this is really important. So what we need to do is rewind a little bit as well to think of, so when Brexit happened, one of the big criticisms of the EU was sovereignty, right? So this was supposed to be about the UK not having sovereignty and being able to make decisions on our own and not having rules thrust upon us by the EU, okay? And you know, we can get into the long weeds of arguing about whether that was really an issue at the time. And I could bore you with data on that as well, but I won't, because this isn't about Brexit per se. This isn't about the EU really, or Brexit at all. This is about logical consistency. So, but it's about sovereignty. What's interesting here, so I'm going to go back and talk to this comment now, which is, remember the UK responded to Ukraine's needs while the EU was still trying to organise a meeting to discuss it, not shouting for Brexit, but don't assume it's black and white. And this comment, which is that basically we were able to react really quickly because we were outside of the EU. But then how come Poland and the Czech Republic were able to act really quickly, and in fact arguably quicker than us, or gave lots of things? Just they are kind of smaller GDP nations, so it might not have been sounding as big, but actually Poland, what they did with refugees was phenomenal, right? And that's not equated often in the amount of money given to support Ukraine. And that was something that was brought up in a comment thread yesterday, that when we're comparing aid from different countries, it's really important to say actually 400,000 refugees have gone through the system in Poland, including their education system, the welfare state, all of this. The added costs to that need to be actually evaluated in terms of international aid to Ukraine. So to say that we were able to react really quickly because we were not in the EU is flat out incorrect. And I will call out people for saying that. And I understand why they might say that. But if you're going to say that, then you have to invalidate, you have to say, well, the Czech Republic and Poland, who did equally that kind of stuff at early doors, I mean, you've got a problem. Like you can't reconcile that, because they were able to do that and they're in the EU, and we were able to do that and we're out of the EU. We weren't able to do that because we were outside of the EU. And this goes back to the idea of sovereignty. Oh, the EU, we can't do anything on our own unilaterally. But you can. There's a great deal of wriggle room within the EU. And if you want to, as a nation, say, I am going to unilaterally, as the nation of X, give money and give weapons to support Ukraine, then you can go and do that. Poland have showed that. The Czech Republic has showed that. The Baltic states have showed that with aplomb, right? And the UK have done that, and we're not in the EU. So it doesn't matter whether you're in the EU or out of the EU, you are able to make unilateral decisions with your own sovereignty to aid Ukraine. And indeed, many countries have done that. And some countries were quicker than others. And France and Germany were slow, and now they've picked up, and now they're level pegging, right? To differing degrees, perhaps, not that if you're level pegging, that's all 1 degree, but you get the point, right? And so France and Germany were slow, and now they're caught up, and now they're doing really well. Thank you very much. That has very little to do with the EU. Now, when the EU, so what he's saying, and Francis Donny is kind of correct in a point here, which it took a long time for the EU to get together, but that's what happens when you have a democratic institution. So that what's often been the criticism of functioning democracies is they're slow to make decisions because decisions have to be made democratically, whereas an autocracy, dictatorship, can make decisions really quickly and go and do it. So when you have someone like Putin invading another country, democracies take a long time to kind of pick up and work things out. So the bigger that organization is, the slower it will be to react. And that is a criticism against the EU, but it goes against this idea that it's an unelected, corrupt EU. No, it's precisely because it's full of up almost 30 democratically elected countries represented within that democratic framework that actually it takes some time to get going. But once it has got going, the EU has been incredibly important in supporting Ukraine. So I think it's about being fair to the EU, but about being fair to logic here, about employing consistency when we are looking at stuff. And I thought it was really important to say that. I wanted to make a separate video just to make sure that this is understood, because I think it is important. Now, as I say, this is not about the benefits of being in or out of the EU, but it's if you're going to attack something, you need to be consistent when you're doing it with your beliefs over here. And I hope that makes sense to what is being said. And in fact, one of the most important statements that kind of sums this up is what a chap called True Solman said here. He said, the UK would still have been able to act quickly to help Ukraine early on if it had remained in the EU. Member states have full control over their national military assets and can act independently. For example, France flew fighter jets to attack pro-Gaddafi forces in Libya when Benghazi was threatened. France did not consult the EU first. So that puts paid. I mean, with all due respect, and I'm not having got these people individually. Thank you very much, Trevor Knight. That's a really nicely phrased comment. Like I always say, challenge me, and this is a perfect example of how to challenge, which is, I disagree with you, and here's why I disagree with you. Just doing it nicely and respectfully, and I really appreciate it. Same with all these people here. Nigel Cadiz said this in fine ways. I just disagree with their conclusions. In fact, True Solman said, true, but if the UK was still inside the EU, nothing prevents a member state from acting independently on such an issue. It's like super, super important. And indeed, when someone here says, so Hungary is attacking me back, says, so Hungary hasn't or isn't blocking any EU support for Ukraine. Hungary is a real problem, but that is, so when someone says, so you want us to be governed by an unelected, corrupt EU, but when you have Hungary blocking something, that is them exercising their democracy, right? So you've got to be really careful. I mean, that is the nature of democracy. If you're going to have a big bunch of countries together and some of them aren't going to agree, then it's going to be quite difficult when you need unanimity to make a decision. And what happens is Hungary has actually rescinded some of its transparent democratic values, some of those democratic mechanisms and corruption that's taking place in there, freedom of press, all these things. So you can't say the EU is corrupt. I mean, there's corruption everywhere in the world, but is it more or less corrupt than outside the EU? Well, actually, since you have to jump through hoops to get into the EU and you have to pass corruption, transparency and democratic values and mechanisms, tests to get into the EU, then you are more likely to have less corruption and less autocracy within the EU than without, right? And this is why the EU is a threat to Russia, because on the doorstep of Russia is this bastion of democracy and kind of freedom. If you're anti-EU, you might not agree with that, but that's how Russia see it. And Ukraine want to be a part of that. And so that is a threat to Russia itself. Now, Ukraine will actually struggle to become a part of the EU until, and this is why they're trying really hard to sort out the corruption and sort out some of these issues that they have, because you have to jump through some hoops to get into the EU, which is why after, 15 years or however long, Serbia still aren't in the EU, which is why certain countries, Turkey didn't get in. And when we were scared in 2016 with Boris Johnson saying, oh, Turkey, 80 million Turks are suddenly going to be in the EU, they were never going to get in the EU. They wouldn't have passed on freedom of press alone. And that wasn't going to, never got sorted out. So, you know, we need to understand what's going on here, and we need to understand that uh, that the EU might be slow to react in certain circumstances precisely because it is democratic and takes time to make decisions. Democracy has pros and cons. Being really super quick to make decisions is not one of the characteristics of a full functioning democracy, because a full functioning democracy, you need everyone's opinion to be reflected. And so when you're making a massive decision like going to war, you can't just, like Putin with a couple of his mates, go down a pub and draw out a plan to invade Ukraine on the back of a cigarette packet and then go, right, let's do it. Right, and get the army and go and do that. That ain't going to happen in any country in the EU, in Britain, where we have something approaching a functioning democracy. So, anyway, that's my claims. Now, those are my claims. If you would like to disagree with that, I'd be well up for debating this. This isn't so much about the EU in and of itself, about the pros and cons of the EU, but about are we being logically consistent when looking at this issue of countries being able to act unilaterally? Do they represent the EU, or are they just countries within the EU? There are countries in the EU and there is the EU. And if a country in the EU acts, it doesn't mean the EU acts, and it doesn't mean they are representative of the EU or the EU is representative of them. Okay, cool, nice. Thanks. Take care. I will do a proper update extra later.